It's great to have you here today. My name is Ken, and trust you had a good summer last week. So we are in our final week of our series, and I just want to say a big welcome to those who are watching online or down at our Kitchener campus or at our Waterloo campus. We're in our last week of our series. It's simply called, can you say it with me? How to be rich. We've been talking about how to be rich. And this is something that every one of us should be pursuing, and something everybody can be pursuing. And we've been hanging around a particular statement that's made by the Apostle Paul to a letter that he wrote to his protege, Timothy. And in that letter, he tells Timothy to talk to Christians this way. He says, command them to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. I need you to read this with me one more time. This is the last time we'll read this together. Are you ready? Command them to be rich in good deeds and to be generous and willing to share. So Paul is saying, attention, I want you to be rich followers of Jesus. And he talks about three areas specifically. He says, good deeds, do good deeds to other people, be generous, in which he's speaking primarily about our money, I believe, and then be willing to share the stuff that you have with other people who can use it for a while and then hopefully return it. That's what he's asking us to do. So command them to be rich. And we've been talking in particular about the money piece. Now today, we have been working our way towards today. Today we're going to be talking about you and your money and the money that you give to Creekside. Isn't that cool? And other ministries that would be similar. So we're really kind of drilling down a little bit, and now you're starting to feel a little uncomfortable. And I'm glad, because it means you're going to pay attention a little more, right? And that's all good. So we're going to be talking about this morning. And here's what I'm going to do when I talk about this. I'm going to make a statement that I believe is culled out of what the Bible teaches us, what God has for us in terms of our giving financially. And then I'm going to kind of unpack it for the rest of the morning, okay? So it goes like this. Giving to God is all about the why and the how, and has little to do with the what. Okay? You tracking with me? Giving to God is all about the why and the how, and has little to do with the what. When I'm talking about the what, I'm talking about the amount that you give, the percentage that you give, the money that you give. I'm telling you that giving to God has little to do with that, and everything to do about with two other things: the why you give and the how you give. The why you give, the reason for your giving, the motivation behind your giving is more important than what you give. And the how you give, the manner in which you give, the way you go about giving is also more important than what you give. In fact, I'll put it this way. I'm going to put words into God's mouth. This is a little dangerous, but let me do it. If your why isn't right and your how isn't right, please keep your money. I don't want it. That's what I believe God says. And you may say, whoa, that's stretching it a little bit, isn't it? Well, I think you'll find as we look this morning that it's not, in fact, stretching it at all. In fact, let me say it another way. If you get the why and the how right, the what will take care of itself. The issue is around, why do you give? What motivates you to give? What compels you to give? What are the reasons for your giving? And then how do you go about doing that? In light of those reasons, how does that show up? So the why drives the how evidences or shows the why that's inside your heart. Again, let me put it this way. God could be saying this: I don't really care about the what. I care about the why and the how. And I would go so far as to say this, okay? And I've worked on this statement over and over all week. I've rewritten it, rethought it, and hopefully it's kind of accurate. Here we go. There are few, if any, places in the Bible where God tells us the amount to give as a free will offering to him. There are few, if any, places in the Bible where God tells us the amount to give of a free will offering to him. Let me say this to you. I wanted to say there is no place in the Bible where God tells you how much to give, the what to give when it comes with a free will offering. But I figure somebody will find a place where he does. So I'm just kind of hedging my bets here and saying, no, I'm just going to say there are few, if any, but I'd like to say there are no places where God tells you how much to give as a free will offering to him. Now, in fact, here's what I'd say. Rather, the Bible spends its energy focusing on the why and the how to give. It spends its energy focusing on the why and the how to give. Let me go back to what our original statement was. Giving to God is all about the why, the motivation, the the reason, and the how, the manner, and has little to do with the what, the amount. Now, some of you are sitting there and you're thinking, nope, you are wrong, Ken. You are wrong because there's this word in the Bible. It's got 5 letters, and it goes like this, tithe. And if you know anything at all about that word, Ken, you'll know that tithe talks about 10%, and that's the what piece. So it does tell us what to give. So there, you're wrong. You went to school, and you still don't know how to read the Bible really well, okay? And maybe you're thinking that. And I just want to tell you, I actually have heard of tithing, and I understand about it, but I'm still going to go back to my original statement that God doesn't talk about the what. Not when it comes to free will offering. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend some time at the beginning of our chat right now talking about the what, and then I'm going to spend some time looking at the why and the how, okay? So we're going to talk about the what. And I am going to tell you, there are lots of people that disagree with me, okay? What I'm about to tell you. In fact, there's actually some of our pastoral staff team who disagree with me. They're still working here, so it's something we can have a conversation about, you know what I'm saying? But there are really, really great godly men and women who know theology, who study the Bible, who will tell you that I'm wrong. I think of a guy named Timothy Keller, who I have high respect for in terms of his capacity to lead and teach and so on and so forth. There's other leaders who, such as John MacArthur, if you've ever heard of him, who would be standing up and applauding me today. So what you're going to find is that there are like various perspectives on this particular view, and I want you to be wrestling with this yourself, and hopefully by the end of our time together this morning, by the way, no matter what your view on the what is, I hope that you'll be able to say that God is really interested in the why and the how, and that's just really, really important. But let's talk about this what thing, okay? And let me just make kind of a blanket statement and then show you why I think this is true. Here we go. Tithing means 10%. So we could say 10%ing, okay? Or tithing was the method used to calculate the amount of money the people of Israel needed to give to support the worship, social, and civil needs of the nation. Tithing was the method used to calculate the amount of money the people of Israel needed to give to support the worship, social, and civil needs of the nation. You go, well, that makes sense to me. So tithing means 10%. You need to understand that in the nation of Israel and the nations around, that everything was based mathematically on the number 10. The reason that was true is because we have 10 fingers, 10 toes. So 10 was a great number. 10 was a number of completion. I got all my fingers, I got all my toes. It's a complete number. It's a beautiful number that way, right? So 10% became a way of representing the 10 number of completion. And tithing was something that it was a mathematical term that was used all the time by countries, both nations, both Israel and outside of Israel. God took the tithing number, the tithing principle, and applied it very specifically to the nation of Israel to the point where they have 3 tithes, okay? 3 tithes that the nation of Israel had. 3 10% that they needed to give away. But a different, unique kind of giving, I'm going to call it required giving, which is different from free will giving, okay? So this is required giving. Let me talk about the tithes. There are 3 of them. The first is the Levitical tithe, the Levitical 10%. Every year, the children of Israel needed to give, once they were coalesced as a nation and living in the promised land, they needed to give 10% of their money every year, of their goods or whatever, to the Levites. The Levitical tithe was a tithe given to the tribe of Levi. How many tribes were there in Israel? There were 12. And when they came into the promised land, Joshua divided up the land into how many separate sections? 11. Who didn't get any land? The Levites, okay? Now, when you don't have any land, you don't have any way of living, okay? There's nothing you can grow. There's no flocks you can put out on the pastures. So what the Levitical tithe was, it was the way for God to take care of the tribe of Levi. What did the tribe of Levi do? What was their responsibility? Their responsibility was to be the priests, to take care of the worship, basically to govern the country. This is a theocracy. There is no king. So the tribe of Levi functions under God to lead the nation. So here's what we read for this Levitical tithe. I give, this is God, I give to the Levites all the tithes in Israel as their inheritance for return for the work they do while serving at the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting would have been the tabernacle, that first place of gathering, that big tent they used to carry around. the nation of Israel. And then when eventually Solomon built a permanent temple, just in representation of the tabernacle, that tent that they carried around. So the first tithe, 10%, if you're in Israel now, if you're a Jew in Israel right now, 10% of your money goes towards the Levites every year. That's the Levitical tithe. Here's the second tithe. It's called the festival tithe, the festival 10%. Deuteronomy chapter 12 talks about this one. Let me just explain it to you. This is a tithe that you eat, okay? It's 10% of your food, flocks, grains, whatever it would be, that you would bring to have a potluck party, okay? Basically, that's what it was. And so the whole nation would gather together for this incredible number of days of partying. And the idea was to celebrate the goodness of God, to worship God, to adore God, to magnify God, and to produce unity among the nation. They loved to party. This sounds like a whole sermon series we need to do, because I don't think we party enough. Israel was right into it, man. It was big time. God wanted them to do that. So 10% of their income was given towards this great celebration that they had. Levitical 10%, the festival 10%. There's another one. It's called the poor tithe. If you were fatherless, that is, you were an orphan, you were a widow, you were a widower, you had some reason for not being well off financially, you were a person who just moved, from another country that was moving to Israel, then you were going to be taken care of by this third tithe. But the unique thing about this third tithe is that unlike the first one, the Levitical tithe, which was 10% every year, and the festival tithe, which was also 10% every year, the poor tithe was 10% every 3 years. So on the third year, it was an extra 10%. And here's what we read. At the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment, that is no land, and no inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. God wants you to give this so that you can in turn feed the people who are poor. So far we've got 3 tithes, okay? Levitical, festival, and the poor tithe. 10% every year, 10% every year, 10% every 3 years. So let's do the math. 10% plus 10% plus 1/3 of 10%. I'm going to stretch it out over that. Every year there'd be 1/3 of that 10th, right? Which means about 23% a year. The tithes were. On top of the tithing, they also had to do some other things. If you were a farmer, you needed to leave the corners of your fields unharvested for poor people, widows, and so on, to take as for food. There were also taxes that were added in the sacrificial system. There was some kind of a payment that was levied to make that happen as well. But let's round it off to about 23% a year. So if you believe in tithing, I believe that you should be giving 23% a year. Okay, which most people go, okay, I'm not sure I'm with tithing at that point. Let me say to you that I believe that tithing was a form of taxation, okay? This is how the nation was going to function. So I'd put it this way. Tithing was designed to pay for the priestly program, the national religious program, and the welfare program of the nation of Israel. Tithing is or was Israel's form of taxation. So they were taxed at around 23% a year in order for the nation to function. Do you know what you pay as a Canadian for taxes in a year? Any of you looked it up? I looked it up this week. I wish I didn't know the number, okay? It's like 42.5% is what we're paying on taxes. You're thinking, I like tithing. I really do. Can we go back in time, right? So there was 23% that they had to pay. This was not optional, okay? And you know how, and I love, it's really much simpler. You're filling out your tax forms this year, like you only got a month to go, right? You're filling them all out, and you're going, this number plus this minus this, subtract that. You're going crazy, right? So you hire people, or you get some software, or you just hope you don't get thrown in jail and you send it off. Those kinds of things happen to us, right? This was a pretty easy system. 10, 10, and every 3 years another 10. It's what we call required giving. They had to do this. It was part of what let the nation function, okay? But there is another kind of giving that wasn't required, and we're going to call it, for lack of a better word, free will giving or free will offering. And this was There's the taxes. That's the tithing to keep the nations functioning. You've got to do that or we won't survive. We won't be healthy. We won't be happy. But there's also now, on top of that, you need to give something from out of your heart, okay? Toward worship, toward God, toward elevating him. Free will giving, I'm going to suggest to you, has always been up to the individual. That when you put tithing in the right place, you'll discover that there's free will giving that happens all the way through the Bible, okay? And it's the free will giving, not the tithing, that I believe that God is calling us to today. That's my point. And that's what the what is. It's that required giving. So there are, again, these two kinds of free will giving. One is called first fruits. Let's talk about this free will giving. Let's talk about first fruits giving. First of all, there are two kinds. And I'm sorry for all the first words and free words and everything else in there. But there's two kinds of this free will offering or giving. One of them is called first fruits giving. First fruits giving was the giving of the first part of the harvest, where God would say to the people, I want you to just give it, okay, in worship to me, in celebration of me, to help fulfill the mission that I have you as a nation of Israel on, to be the light of the world. And so what would happen is that they would come to their harvest. When their harvest came out, the first part of their harvest, they could take as much of that as they wanted to and come and bring it to God as an act of free giving, of worshiping God by giving that, right? So here's what we read in the text. Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, and your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. And God is really saying to the people of Israel, to the nation of Israel, I want you to give your first fruit. Figure out what you want to give of that first fruits, of that first part of the harvest, and give it to me. And I want to tell you that I'm going to bless you as a result of that. Now, this is a promise that's given to the nation of Israel, okay? Your vats are going to brim over with new wine. I don't have any vats at my home, and I don't have any barns either, okay? This is a promise that's directly given to Israel. Some people have taken this promise and other promises in the Old Testament in the covenant with Israel and said, and preached this thing called the wealth and health gospel. I don't know if you've heard of this or not, but it's out there, and basically what it says, you give to God, he's going to bless you back again. So give a lot more, and God will bless you back again. It's kind of a give to get kind of mindset, and I want to say to you, that's not the way you're supposed to give. That's the wrong motivation, okay? But one of the things that children of Israel had the free choice to do was to look at the first part of their harvest and pick some of that first part, not the second or the third. He said, I want the first part. I'm God. I deserve that. Pick from some of it and give it to me. So that's the first fruits giving. Then there's what's called the free will giving. And this is just a giving that can come for various projects or various things. It's something that God required the people to do. And if you remember when Moses is going to build this tabernacle, this tent in the wilderness as they're traveling around, here's what we read. The Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to bring me an offering. You are to receive the offering for me from each man whose heart prompts him to give. You'll notice what God says here. Doesn't talk about the what, doesn't talk about how much, there's no percentage. In fact, he's really only interested in offerings coming from people whose hearts are prompted to participate. So it's an interesting kind of thing that he says, right? He's saying, I want them to be, it's got to be out of their own heart. It's got to be their own desire. I'm not talking about tithing. It's not a 10% thing. It's not even a 5. I'm just asking you to invite the people to participate in this. Sometimes as a church, we will do that. We will say, hey, we're going to expand our facility. Would you be willing to participate in that? And I think it's okay to provide opportunities or challenge people to give. But again, I think the what question is not a 10% question. I think it's a free will decision that you need to choose to make. Giving to God is all about the why, that's the motivation, and the how, that's the manner, and has little to do with the what. Tithing was about the what. Free will offering, giving to God, that is about the heart. That's about the heart. And when you come to 2 Corinthians, chapters 8 and 9, you read the Apostle Paul writing to the Corinthians and telling them how to participate in giving. He never uses the word tithe. He never tells them about a percentage. But what he does do is he focuses on their heart. He focuses on the why and the how. And we're going to spend some time looking at that right now in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 9. Let me ask you a question before we dive in. Are you a generous person? Are you rich in generosity? That's a hard one to answer, right? Maybe you go, oh, I'm kind of sort of, I think, generous. Sometimes maybe. Yeah, okay. Or I'm, maybe kind of, maybe, I don't know. That's maybe I'm cheap. I don't know. How can you help me with this one, Ken? Well, I want to talk to you about the characteristics of a generous person from this passage in 2 Corinthians, okay? And look first of all at this. There are 4 characteristics of a generous person in these 2 chapters, okay? And I want you to ask yourself if they are characteristics of you, okay? And this is the why, and this is the how. Watch this. They give. How do they give? Can you say it with me? Freely. Generous people give freely, okay? They give freely. Watch what Paul says in verse 7. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give. You see that again? It's my decision. Give what you've decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion. Notice this, not reluctantly. Not, we shouldn't have to give. Oh, man. I don't want to do this. Oh, better do it. Maybe God will get me. There's this kind of not reluctantly. And then he says, or under compulsion. In other words, not manipulated, not cajoled, not made to feel guilty, that kind of thing. I hope we are never a church that does that. But sometimes it happens, right? Like you answer the front door. There's that Girl Guide standing there with a box of Girl Guide cookies. And that's the last thing in the world you want. But you look and you realize it's your next door neighbor's daughter. And he's standing out there on the driveway smiling at you. So you buy the Girl Guide cookies, right? Hey, listen, that's not, Paul says, I don't want you to do that. Doesn't feel free, right? I want you to see a generous person. They understand that their giving is a giving of incredible freedom. They're just free to give. And it just really wells out. I get to do this, right? The first thing that's characteristic, you need to ask yourself the question, do I give freely? Or do I feel pushed into this? It's a heart question, really, isn't it? Notice the second one. They give how? Cheerfully. Cheerfully? Cheerfully. Watch this. Here's what he says. God loves what kind of giver? Cheerful giver. Cheerful giver. Now here's what's really, really cool. The New Testament was written originally in Greek, and the word for cheerful is a really cool Greek word. I'm going to tell you the Greek word for cheerful, and you're going to get it right away. The Greek word for cheerful is hilarion. Yeah. Where do we get an English word? Hilarious, right? So what's he saying? I want you to give how? Hilariously, joyfully, cheerfully, excited. I've said before, it'd be really cool if when you put your money in the offering box, and I know some of us are doing direct deposit and so on, but if you put it in the offering box, all of a sudden like a siren would sound and lights would flash and streamers would come down from the sky and a band would sound and we'd go into some kind of a dance because we're cheerfully giving, right, to God. This is what he's really saying to us here. And this is so important because I want to tell you that the why and the how matter more than the what. You ready for this? We're going to go back to the Old Testament because I always believe this is the case. It's always about the why and the how when it comes to that free will giving. Watch what God says here. Because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity, okay? Because you didn't serve me with joy. And I think it's quite easy to say, because you didn't give, not just your time and your energy, but your money to me, joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity. Therefore, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. Do you think your heart attitude matters to God? Ding, ding, ding. Look at that verse, right? He's saying to you and to me, your heart, the why and the how, matter big time to me, right? Gave freely, give cheerfully. Here's the third one. They give, what's the word? You can say it with me? Sacrificially. Sacrificially. Now here's the deal. God is better than, does not deserve the leftovers. Okay? The stuff, I don't like beans anyway. I'll give those to God. And this is kind of cold. And that's kind of gristly meat. I don't want that. So there you go, God. That's your meat. He doesn't want the leftovers. He deserves the best. Now, in this passage in 2 Corinthians, Paul, you remember? I talked about this the second week in our series. He's writing to the Corinthians, and wants them to give, and he's going to be compelling them, or not compelling them, he's going to be inviting them to give, he's going to be directing them to give, he's going to be teaching them how to give. I think we have to do that, okay? He's challenging them to give, and he's going to illustrate it with a group of Christians called the Macedonians, who are going through a terrible, terrible time, but are giving money Ultimately, this is a request to help Christians in Jerusalem who are going through a famine. So he says this, in the midst of a very severe trial, their, that is the Macedonians, overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity, for I testify that they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability, entirely on their own. They urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. So he's saying these Macedonians gave sacrificially, like they sacrificed to give. They gave up so they could give away. What are you giving up so you can give away? Or is God getting the leftovers? That's really the question. I know this is kind of convicting. One of my favorite authors, pastors, preachers, is a guy named John Ortberg. And in a sermon one time, he said these words, the World Bank has estimated that 1.2 billion of our world's poor live on $1 a day. The UN says that if an additional $70 to $80 billion a year were made available, it could provide access to basic health care and education for all the poor in the world, okay? $70 to $80 billion would take care of all that 1.2 billion people, okay? He writes this, if American Christians, that's just people in the United States, just in the US, who call themselves Christians, would give 10% of their money away, it would mean another $143 billion. Hear that now? $1 billion a year. That would be enough private dollars to provide health care and education for all the poor in the world and still leave $60 to $70 billion to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Wow, those are stunning numbers. And I know sometimes people will go, God, where are you? Why don't you take care of us? And I don't know that God might say, you have everything you need to take care of each other. Why aren't you doing it? There needs to be, and a generous person is not only somebody who gives freely and cheerfully, but they choose to sacrifice because generosity matters that much to them. Here's the fourth. They give, and the word is confidently. And what that means is that they're giving with the confidence that this is an ROI. The return on investment in this giving to God is like out of this world. God is going to do some amazing things with this. Now, they want to be wise with their giving, but they also are entrusting God to do something incredible with this giving. And here's what we read in the passage in verse 10. Now, he, that is God, who supplies the seed to the sower, he's ultimately giving the seed to us so that we can sow, and bread ultimately comes from him for food, will also supply and increase your store of seed and will enlarge the harvest of your righteousness. He's going to take what you give, he's going to enlarge it, he's going to bless it, he's going to use it in incredibly amazing ways. This is what God will do. And a generous person is a person who has confidence in God and says, I'm going to give this believing that God is going to take this money and do some amazing things with it. Giving to God is all about the why and the how and has little to do with the what. It has little to do with the what. Some people might say, how do I do this thing? What do I do? And I just want to tell you, when it comes to this whole idea of a free will offering, it's interesting that when you look into the Bible, you're going to see a huge spectrum of what it is that people give. So if you go to Abraham, for example, who was living at this time outside the boundaries of the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel did not exist at this point. Abraham, it tells us in one place, gave to a priest king 10% of the top of the wealth that he had captured from an enemy city. He chose to give 10%. Again, this 10 number is kind of important in the cultural context. Jacob, also living outside of the nation of Israel, we know gave 10% as well. Genesis tells us for both of them that's what they chose to give. It's a free will offering. It wasn't demanded of them. You go a little bit later and you come to King David. And when King David wanted to build the tabernacle, the temple, the firm and final facility, it tells us that he gave, in today's money, out of his own pocket, billions of dollars toward the building of the temple. Likely way more than 10%. We come into the time of Jesus, and he talks about a widow who puts some money in the offering. Remember this? She puts in just what we would call maybe 2 pennies, and he applauds what she gives, way more than 10%. We come to the Macedonians that we've already looked at, and we realize that they gave a significant amount as well, like obviously more than what they had, than 10% for sure, because they were giving up sacrificially and were a model. So you can see there's a whole spectrum of things that are happening here. People who believe in tithing as the answer would say to you that you should be giving 10%. They'll take the tithe, the 10% word, and they'll apply it, and they'll say that's a good place. They're not saying to you that's the maximum you can give, but they would argue that's something that you should give. And they sometimes will say, depending on who you talk to, that you should give above that. That's your free will offering above the 10%. The 10% is what you should give. That's kind of required. But then there is this gifting above that. Or they will take the 10% and say that's a model from the Old Testament, and I want to apply that. People who would not be into tithing will often use the 10% as well. And they will say, and you've heard some people who might be sort of into the money sort of side of life, they're pretty good at this. They will argue it's really good if you give 10%, save 10%, and live on 80%. They will talk about it that way. But each person needs to be fully persuaded in his or her own heart. You need to be fully persuaded. To help us with, I want to read you a story that it's one of my favorite stories, and I've read it here a few times before, but I think it can help sort of solidify the whole of what we've been talking about in our series about how to be rich. Just it's kind of a fun story, and I love it. So forgive me if you've heard this a few times, but here we go. I learned how to play Monopoly from my grandmother. She was a wonderful person. She raised 6 children. She was a widow by the time that I knew her. But she was the most ruthless Monopoly player I ever knew in my entire life. She understood that the name of the game was to acquire. And when I got my initial money from the bank, I just tried to hold on to it because I didn't want to lose any of it. She spent everything. Bought stuff she landed on as soon as she could, and she'd mortgage stuff to buy other stuff. And eventually, as the game goes, my grandmother would own everything. She would be the master of the board. She understood that money was how you keep score in that game, and that possessions were a matter of survival. And she beat me every time. And at the end of the game, she'd look at me and say, "One day you'll learn how to play the game." She's kind of cocky, my grandmother. "One day you'll learn how to play the game." And after I was about 10, I played every day, when I was about 10, I played every day with a kid that lived in our neighborhood. And it dawned on me as we were playing every day, all through the summer, that the only way to beat somebody at Monopoly was a total commitment to acquisition. That summer, I learned how to play the game, and by the time fall rolled around, I was more ruthless by far than even my grandmother. I went to play her, and I was willing to do anything to win. I was willing to bend the rules. I played with sweaty palms, slowly, cunningly. I exposed the soft underbelly of my grandmother's weakness. Relentlessly, inexorably, I drove her off the board. The game does strange things to you. I can still remember it like yesterday. It happened at Marvin Gardens. I looked at my grandmother. This is the person who taught me how to play. She was an old woman by now. She was a widow. She had raised my mother. She loved me, and I took everything she had. I destroyed her financially and psychologically. I watched her give up that last dollar and quit in utter defeat. This is the greatest moment of my life. And then she had one more thing to teach me, my grandmother. Then she said to me, "Now, it all goes back in the box. All the houses and hotels, boardwalk and park place, all those railroads and utilities, all of that wonderful money, it all goes back in the box," she said. I didn't want it to go back in the box. I wanted to leave the board out permanently, bronze it maybe, as a memorial to what I had achieved. See, when she said it all goes back in the box, it was kind of a way of saying to me that none of it is really yours. None of it belongs to you. You don't own any of it. You just get to use it for a little while, and then it all goes back in the box. And next time, it will all go to somebody else. That's the way the game works. So when you play the game, don't forget this one lesson. When the game comes to an end, and the game always comes to an end, the stuff all goes back in the box. And here's the question. that I believe God is asking us today with this How to Be Rich series. What are you going to do with the stuff before it all goes back in the box? What are you going to do with that stuff? Well, I want to thank you for being people who give, because God has been able to use our giving in incredible ways. And we've been in this series every Sunday showing you a slice of what God has blessed us to be able to do. And I want to give you one more slice right now. This is our Celebrate Recovery program, and how God has just used this in really amazing, amazing ways as a result of your giving and other people serving it. Watch this. So thank you. Thank you for doing that. Yeah. It's pretty amazing, really, what God has been using that in our lives. Hey, there's one more verse I want to give to you, and it happens to come at the very end of chapter 9 in 2 Corinthians. And I think it's a reflection of the heart of our God. Here's what it says. Whoops, I got to go back. Thanks be to God for his indescribable generosity, his indescribable gift, and that gift is Jesus, and life with God through him. We have a God who's generous, and he longs for his people to be a people who are absolutely generous with what they have. So that's how to be rich. That's what we've been talking about. I want to share with you, if I can, just actually before I do that, I want to just pray. Let's just bow our heads and pray, okay? Heavenly Father, thank you for the command to be rich. I think of the call for us to be rich in good deeds, and pray that we would be a people who do that. I pray for the call to be generous with our money and to share our stuff, and ask that might be true of us. I mean, I have a longing, a dream that Creekside would be like the most generous group of people on the planet. And I pray that you would help us to grow into that. I want to be more generous in my own life for your glory and for the good of others. Thank you for challenging us with this. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be generous. May we leverage it for your glory and know what it means to give, be generous, with freely generous, cheerfully generous, sacrificially, and confident. May that be true of us, and help our hearts to be in the right place. In Jesus' name, amen.